Brothers, sisters, comrades, and friends, welcome once again to Logical Fallacy. Okay, some context. Last week, with June being Pride Month in most of Europe, I was commissioned by my company to film a piece of queer-centric content, a video talking to queer people about their experience with pride and how that intersects with their perspective on personal pleasure, with sex toys being central to that conversation. What role do sex toys play in people's sexual identity as they experience it through queerness? It wasn't a very commercial project. The goal was not to drive sales, but rather to amplify some queer voices through our mutual networks. Very simple stuff. And one of the questions that the interviewer put to our interviewees was the following: are sex toys inherently queer? It's an interesting question, and it's been rolling around my mind for a long time. It was really good to sit down with some queer people with some lived experience and to talk about whether they believed a sex toy can be inherently queer. And their answers were very interesting. And I want to address the issue today with you. Now, perhaps I should start with a little bit of inward focus for this, perhaps just a few words about my own identity and my own position here. So I wouldn't usually do this, but it might be relevant so that you understand where this conversation, this debate comes from and where I stand in it. Now, I'm certainly not straight, but I don't personally identify as queer either. I think that as a straight presenting white cis man, I shouldn't be allowed to self identify as queer. I think the word queer implies something politically radical, which I am demonstrably not. For example, although my identity politics and my personal progressivity are very queer in a sense, my own identity itself is not. People like me, in the eyes of history, are in fact the oppressors, and therefore, while the word queer is being reclaimed by the oppressed, I don't think people who look like me or sound like me should be able to lay any claim to it. And that makes me unqualified to talk about what is queer and what is not queer. Without the cachet of life experience that's required of growing up queer in a straight culture, it's not really for me to engage with the question of whether or not sex toys are queer. Certainly not from a queer perspective. I can't do that. But I find myself wanting to talk about this topic anyway, aware as I am of my own shortcomings within the conversation. So anything I say, I kind of submit for consideration only. Feel free to disregard it or argue with it, at least until a more authoritative voice talks out on this subject. At the moment, I haven't really heard anybody say whether or not they think sex toys are queer. The question itself feels very novel, quite disruptive. And I feel like with my experience in sex toys, I can at least bring that expertise to my points. So, with those disclaimers in mind, having front loaded this podcast with the disclaimer that I am not queer and therefore have no right to adjudicate or to arbitrate on anything that might or might not be queer, it is useful to kind of look at what queerness is. Perhaps we can find a way in that way. Perhaps there is an objective, external way to lens through which to perceive this concept of sex toys being inherently queer or not. So I understand queerness to be less an easily categorized identity and more something like a community which identifies itself by the rejection of conformity to cultural convention. And queerness rejects social convention through gender and sexual expression. Previous models of it might be punk, that expresses its nonconformity through music. Here we're talking specifically about identity, identity politics, sex and sexuality, and sexual expression too, specifically with regards to sex toys. That is to say, there is no stable definition of queerness. It deliberately defies definition. That's the point of it. That's the point of reclaiming that particular term. And that makes it difficult to judge whether something is queer or not. Who has the right to say that? What intrinsic qualities of a thing can make it queer or not queer? So instead of trying to define it, which is doomed to failure, and also I'm not the right person to try, I'm just going to assume that you have some concept of queerness already in your head, and that it's probably similar to what's in my head. And in that way, I'm just going to assume that you know what I'm talking about when I talk about queerness. And that mutual understanding of queerness that you and I share will be the basis for defining whether or not sex toys can be called queer. I'll just assume that we all know roughly what I'm talking about. And that, with that, that's the end of the fucking preamble. So let's just get to it. Are sex toys inherently queer? Well, I think there is an interesting answer and a short answer. And the short answer is no. Sex toys cannot be inherently queer because nothing can be inherently anything. No inanimate object has any abstract significance intrinsically. Saying a sex toy is queer is saying the same as, I don't know, a bicycle is inherently fascist or something, or Roundtree's fruit pastels are inherently bourgeois. Okay, maybe that's a bad example, but you get the point. Ascribing conceptual qualities to physical things is going to be a non-starter. All of it is projection. And we tend to see the things that we care about in the way that we want to see them anyway. So to call sex toys queer is because we want to see them as queer. And because nothing physical and nothing inanimate can have any abstract value other than what we ascribe to it, then a sex toy can't be inherently queer because nothing can be inherently anything. But I also think that a flat no to the idea that sex toys are queer is to understand the issue superficially. And also, it's just a boring answer. I'd like to go beyond that in this conversation, saying that sex toys aren't inherently queer. It feels kind of metaphysical to me and not very satisfying. Like when you're winning an argument with someone and then they say, but what of this? What if none of this really exists, man? What if we're living in the Matrix, man? What if we're just a brain in a pan? I think it's a shitty way to end a debate. And metaphysics is for cowards, is basically my point. And I'd like to take it away from the metaphysics and understanding that nothing can have any inherent abstract quality because anything that we ascribe to them is a projection of ourselves. Understanding all of that, I still think that you could make a case that sex toys are queer. I'm going to try to make that case. I am going to try to tell you and convince you that sex toys are intrinsically queer. So let's get started. Okay, my first argument can be summarized like this. Sex toys uncouple pleasure from partnered sex. That is to say, the idea of penis in vagina sex is no longer central to our conception of sexual activity. And that's largely thanks to things like sex toys. Sex toys have been pioneering in their ability to kind of decouple sex from the social convention of straight, coupled, partnered, penis and vagina sex, sexual intercourse. Sex is no longer defined by sexual intercourse in the conventional sense. And sex toys have been a major, major part of that. While masturbation is surely not in and of itself a queer act, it is certainly possible to masturbate queerly, I think. Since much of masturbation and pleasure in general is mostly an inner world, an experience as much of fantasy as it is of physicality, especially at the point of orgasm. I mean, if you've ever taken a moment to think about what you're thinking about at the point of orgasm, it's usually not on the immediate physical sensations that you're feeling or the erotic stimulus that's right in front of you or all around of you. At the moment of that orgasm, you're usually fantasizing about something else, something other than what's happening to you right here and right now. Or perhaps you're remembering some particularly good previous sex act from your past or something like that. Whatever it is, at that most ecstatic moment, all of it is happening internally. The orgasm is a product of your mind. And sex toys facilitate that. And in doing so, they de emphasize the social pressure to enjoy only straight penetrative sex and instead allow you to focus on your relationship with yourself and to allow yourself to disappear into a moment of internal fantasy, limitless in its scope. Sex toys indirectly deconstruct cultural relationships. When we think about sex, we think about straight penis and vagina, penetrative sex. And sex toys turn that upside down. And that's pretty queer, don't you think? Let me put it another way. Sex toys decentralize the role of sexual pleasure as a means for reproduction. They allow sexual pleasure to be enjoyed for its own sake. That's quite radical and subversive and progressive, and therefore, I think, quite queer. I think, in fact, it meets a lot of the criteria required for queerness, however you choose to define queerness. Something radical about that. Something radical and intimate. Something personal and political. Okay, having said that, I can kind of sense a counter argument, and that's this. Sex toys sometimes reinforce binary gender stereotypes and even create unrealistically aspirational standards of sex and anatomy. So let me explain. Let me take an example of what I'm talking about there. Let's take realistic dildos. That is to say, dildos that are uh, modeled to be anatomically correct. That is, they have veins and testicles and they look realistic in some way. So the criticism of my point about sex toys being queer could be that realistic dildos reinforce the idea that sex should be penetrative sex between a person with a penis and a person with a vagina. And doesn't the existence of large dildos and the fact that most dildos and penetrative vibrators on the market are larger than the average penis, doesn't that imply an unhealthy relationship with the penis? Doesn't that centralize the penis in sex? In other words, aren't penis shaped, that is to say, phallic sex toys, potentially regressive even? And if they're potentially regressive, isn't that the opposite of queer? And just so there's no bias here, on the flip side of that, why, for example, are male masturbators always marketed as being super tight? Isn't that just a tiny bit judgmental? Isn't that regressive? Isn't that passing a judgment about the expectations we have for our partner's body? My immediate response to that counter argument is no. No, I don't think a realistic dildo is regressive, nor do I think a dildo centralizes the penis as a part of sexual activity. This is going to take a little cognitive leap for me to explain this. This is going to take some wide strides to be able to make my point. But come with me for a moment. Think about how weird sex toys are. Think about the massive, massive cognitive leaps of creativity that it takes to design and make a fake penis with exaggerated features and then have sex with it. this, this inanimate avatar of a human penis. That is mind blowing. That is an experience so conceptual, so entirely abstract, that it regularly blows my mind to think about that. That is the specific reason why I love sex toys so much and why I devoted much of my life to them. They represent a whole other kind of abstract relationship with yourself. Sex toys are from a different universe. And since sex toys are so abstract, let me pause for a moment and just, just run that back in your head. Imagine the ingenuity that it takes, something completely unique to our species, to design and to create and to mold and to gather the necessary materials to construct this symbolic representation of human anatomy and then to put it into your body and then to have sex with it, to have sex with this doppelganger. And it is the weirdest thing that we do as a species, and that is what makes sex toys so unbelievably fascinating. And I can only hold that up to not be regressive, but to be demonstrably progressive. This ability to think in conceptual terms is very literally what separates us, what makes us unique. It's not language, it's not religion, it's not science, it's not art, and it's not music. All of those are a product of our ability to think conceptually. That's what makes us different. And all of that can be summarized in a realistic dildo. Maybe I'm going off the deep end a little bit, but that is legitimately how I think about these things. It's why I get so excited when I talk about them. It's because they're so abstract, because they're so fascinatingly conceptual, they cannot be reinforcing gender conventions because they themselves transcend convention. They're too abstract. They might be physical lumps of vibrating silicone and so on. But the truth of them is that the relationship we have with them is one of the most creative and ingenious relationships you will ever experience in nature. It must be what summarizes us. We're defined by our dildos. And that's pretty queer. The ability to think in conceptual terms about gender, for example, and about sexuality is also queer. That's where I see parallels between the expression of identity and the expression of sexuality. And I would go even further than that, I think. I would argue, as I am doing loudly, that sex toys actually make our experience of sex less phallocentric, not more phallocentric. It's been my long experience in the sex toy industry that the vast, vast bulk of sales are not of realistic sex toys like phallic dildos or anatomically correct male masturbators and stuff like that. It's actually things like clitoral stimulators, and bullet vibes. And it's clitoral stimulators. It's small, small handheld vibrators that make up the vast majority of all sex toy sales, and cock rings as well. Now, that might be because clitoral stimulators, that is to say bullet vibes and cock rings, tend to be the cheapest sex toys a retailer will offer. So naturally, they're going to sell in larger quantities. But if you go and speak to an experienced sex toy reviewer or a sex journalist or an authority, an educator in sex, they will probably tell you that their favorite sex toy is something like a bullet vibrator, something like a clitoral stimulator. Maybe that or a wand vibrator, which is my own personal favorite because of its versatility. Like Doc Johnson's mega stud 8-inch veiny dildo with squeezable testicles, for example, is never ever going to outsell even the simplest clitoral stimulator. For pure sensation and versatility during partnered sex too, a bullet vibe is like a Swiss Army knife. That's what people really want. The idea that a sex toy is a substitute for real sex, real in inverted commas there, that attitude is long dead. We now see sex toys as additions to sex. A sex toy is not a replacement for a partner anymore, it's a supplement. A sex toy says that sex is for pleasure, and fuck it, you don't even need a partner to be satisfied. You can do this on your own. And a sex toy doesn't care about your politics or your identity or your sexuality. It only knows its own purpose, to provide pleasure. In that way, sex toys, I believe, break down the idea that sex has to conform to any given structure. And using a sex toy is an activity of pure sexual expression, sexual creativity. A sex toy is a celebration of your selfhood. And that sounds pretty queer to me. Okay. Thank you very much for listening once again to Logical Phallusy. Come and talk to me on Twitter at @ThatSexToyGuy. I'd like to hear your opinion. Do you think sex toys are queer? And until next time, ride safe.